Hi everybody. When I started making this video before, I knew it would take a long time because India is one of the more complicated and more in-depth civilizations that's difficult to explain to Westerners, but I didn't know how long it would take. And when the video was done, I'm just like, damn, this needs to be 2 videos. And so that's what I did, and this is the second part to the video on Indian civilization. When we last left off, India had just gone through its massive transformation around 200 BC, where they very could have easily become a completely different civilization from what they're at now, where the old caste system was weakening and the old Brahmanical religious order was losing a lot of its adherents as Buddhism was gaining more control over the country, and the older states were being eaten by the larger Mauryan Empire. And starting at this point, we're going to see how the Brahmins were able to turn all of Indian civilization back and create a totally new direction for how India would develop over the next 2,000 years. Well, let's buckle up. I spent a lot of time working on this India video trying to understand the many complex areas of Indian society. And between all the research, I like to just be able to relax sometimes and play something on my phone for a bit. And that's where Bloodline comes in. Heroes of Life-As is a hero collector fantasy RPG with a 3D art style that lets you collect champions to defend it and the world. The app is free to play and has several unique features, including the hybrid system, where you can create your own unique champions by combining the bloodlines of elves, demons, demigods, orcs, dwarves, lycans, dragonborn, and more. It has 800 plus hybrid champions, and you can inherit their unique appearances. Plus, starting October 27th, they're launching a new set of vampire bloodlines, which looks pretty epic. And for my viewers, Bloodline is offering a starter pack worth $20 for anyone who scans the QR code on the screen, or using the link in the description. This is a really great deal, and I'm sure you guys will have hours of fun playing this. So download Bloodline now and start crafting your heroes. The easiest way to explain this is the Brahmins played a kind of brilliant game that resulted in their continued dominance while all of their kind around the rest of Eurasia lost authority. The way they did this was by creating Hinduism, which I believe is the best constructed religion in the world. Although before the Buddhists, Indians worshipped the same gods as today, as mediated by the Brahmins, however, it wasn't quite modern Hinduism. Modern Hinduism formed as a reaction by the Brahmins against the threat of Buddhism, which was itself an attempted reformation of the old Brahmin order. This gets even more complicated in that Hinduism considers Buddhism to be a sect of Hinduism, and in fact Buddha is a god and saint in Hinduism, but Buddhists consider themselves to be a totally different religion. Hinduism took all the axial age concepts like the broader, stronger sense of God, a moral system that rewarded good behavior and the like from Buddhism to make Hinduism. There are several reasons for why I say Hinduism is the best designed religion in the world. The first is that Hinduism is basically structured to appeal to everyone. Hinduism, in classic Indian fashion, is capable of incorporating everything. The idea in Hinduism is that everything is part of a higher layer of being that envelops it. We're all part of the divine spirit of Brahman, while there are gods that symbolize parts of creation, which gods in turn thus have avatars or reincarnations across certain eras of history, while there are lots of smaller spirits and demons in the world. The Hindus have a very realistic view of a psychology of religion with different tiers of awakening, with saying most people just want pleasure, then going through various levels of personal development through love, self-sacrifice, and the like, until reaching unity with God. Hinduism has countless paths for reaching the divine for different types of psychology. People can reach for the divine through the cult of a certain god, like Shiva, through the highest level of Brahman, or following a local mystic. The French historian Amaury Doriacourt has claimed Hinduism is the best understanding of psychology of anyone in history, far in advance of the modern West, and I would agree. The Indians did something remarkable in that they almost had a scientific method of religion. They would have groups of Brahmins or monks meditate together or take the psychedelic soma, and then corroborate the various evidence that each of them would get, thus creating an image of the universe and the psychic world. The Indo-Aryan pressure towards creativity and creating a logical structure for the world that was applied to science in Europe was instead put into religion in India. From this centuries of development, the Hindus developed an extremely wise view of the universe. The Hindus seem to have invented the idea of the Trinity. They understand that chaos and creation are one and the same. They know that all ideas have a counter-idea, and that the creative tension that comes from that creates the world. Amaury de Riencourt wrote a fascinating and compelling book, in fact, about how the Hindu mystics were able to figure out truths about the universe that modern physics is just discovering. This includes stuff like space and time are the same, that they bend in convoluted ways, and that by compressing them, they create a horrifying explosion, that existence is dependent upon non-existence. The Hindus viewed reality as the edge of a bubble floating in a sea of other bubbles, which is exactly the view propounded by modern physics. They knew that all of the universe is immaterial and in flux, being in fact made of cells and atoms that are constantly vibrating. Buddhism appealed to India's new merchant middle classes. However, Hinduism played its card much better with the other social groups. For the nobility, Hindu appealed to caste and their social superiority. For the peasants, who were often close to starving, the idea of splitting off and denying the world, as propounded by Buddhism, seemed foolish, while Hinduism offered them cults, ceremonies, and superstitions that made their precarious lives seem more certain. Hinduism, by playing these various social groups, was able to gain control over society. However, this came at serious costs. Having the ultra-conservatives win, in effect, put Indian civilization in stasis. From 200 BC, around roughly when this occurred, until the British, you struggle to find any big systemic changes in Indian culture. The Brahmins, whose powers depended upon the caste system, completely solidified caste. Caste had existed in some form for 2,000 years already at least, but in the time around Buddha, people were seriously questioning the institution, with Buddha rejecting the importance of caste, with the lower castes gaining greater social power. However, with the Hindu revival, caste was retrenched in a greater form than ever before. Caste molded into a very strict concrete form, with caste relations becoming steeper and more tightly controlled. It reached a point where in southern India, an untouchable could not step within 25 feet of a Brahmin without polluting him or even making eye contact. The average Indian lost individuality, being forced to stare directly ahead, walking chained in lockstep by the institution of caste. The average Indian's life became completely dominated by taboos that governed their every moment between marriage, work, sleep, cooking, dress, and more, crushing the individual's initiative in every possible way. The second major cost of the conservative victory was women. India became the worst place to be a woman of any major civilization, even more so than Islam. In India, women were married off at age 15 and immediately started having children, thus removing them as creative forces in society, or young men's dynamic desire to prove themselves to get laid and thus atrophying Indian society. It reached a point where if a woman was widowed, rather than remarrying and thus losing her virtue, she was expected to burn herself. Indian society had no place for women, giving them no position in society. Purdah, or the custom of a woman not leaving her house for basically her whole life, became a norm across much of northern India. This became cruelest in lower and middle-class families in which people lived in not great housing anyway, and which women might spend their whole lives behind a poorly ventilated curtain in a shack. Women were often not even expected to eat with their men at the dinner table and faced numerous taboos men did not. I must say an exception should be made for South India, which instead had some of the best treatment of women of anywhere in the world. Women there had something close to legal equality with men and were active participants in the society. Is it any surprise now that South India is the wealthiest and most creative part of India? In general, societies that treat women better are more creative and dynamic than those that repress them. The third group being merchants, which have never been able to rise to predominance in India. India has been very wealthy over its history, consistently being around a quarter of the world's economy in the pre-industrial era. However, in many ways this was due to India's massive population, in which, in the pre-industrial world, individual productivity was so low that GDP was largely tied to population. However, since the merchant classes were the main opponents to the Brahmin order, they were the losers in the social order that developed. This prevented the rise of capitalism, which meant that India's economic order atrophied. European visitors in the 17th and 18th centuries were shocked at how wealthy India was as an area, with its gold-studded noble families and temples with the sheer amount of wealth inside the country. However, at the same time, they were shocked at how inefficient the Indian peasants were, how horribly poor the average person was, and how the economy was lacking in technology and was unwilling to improve efficiency. India was wealthy, with developed manufacturers and basically everything, with very profitable exports like spices. But with the countless caste taboos, there was no way capitalism was able to rework the society towards greater merit and wealth. Likewise, with the completely cynical political ideology, there was no rule of law to protect property rights so that someone's social superior wouldn't just take the fruits of their work. The toxic Indian business culture that developed was that of which has since been called the paper Raj, or that due to all the Brahmanical regulations and competing caste and interest groups, India is known for being an incredibly bureaucratic society in which the sheer amount of complexity and density makes everything from making a horrible totalitarian regime, an aggressive colonial empire, a competitive large corporation, or an industrial sector difficult. India is so diverse that large-scale cooperation of any kind is difficult. However, inside of this, the caste system produces some absolutely incredible groups and people by concentrating human energy in certain small areas. Look at the Indian American population, pulled 90% from India's top Brahmin castes, and is now one of the wealthiest and most successful groups in America. India also produces some of the smartest people in the world on a continual basis. One of the things that Westerners find the most confusing about India is that it operates under entirely different philosophic presuppositions about the world, which makes even understanding how the other group thinks difficult. However, the easiest way to understand the Indian worldview is that they generally view the universe as a chain of being stretching from physical degradation at the lowest state to unity with a pure God at the highest level. The Indians have a view of the world in line with the early Christian sect of Gnosticism, in that the world in of itself is largely cruel and brutal, and that only by transcending into the divine sphere are we capable of perfection. As a comparison, the Abrahamic religions all hold that the world is inherently good, and so instead of India, which wants to reject the physical world, instead wants to improve it and make it more godly. This generally explains most of India's cultural forms. The priests are elevated since they're the closest to the divine, and the untouchables who do physically dirty things like cleaning, killing animals, and the like are the lowest. All the taboos exist as a way to prevent the world from dirtying you. However, this worldview does get even stranger from the Western, where the Indians consider the real world to be Maya or Lalaya, or an illusion spun by the gods, which stands in contrast to great moral truths. This manifests in a couple ways, with some examples being that India had no records of political history before the Muslims arrived in 1000 AD. Believing all of political history, and thus the rise and fall of empires, to be unimportant, while history was only recorded through myths to provide moral guidance for future generations. Another example is that the Indian mind views poverty as a religious, not economic problem. To pre-modern Indians, enriching the poor is small-minded and greedy since greater wealth won't make them happy. Only discovering great spiritual truths will. This is why, under Gandhi's government after World War II, until around the 1990s, the Indian government purposely discouraged industrialization and foreign investment, viewing keeping their intact peasant cultures as more important than increasing the wealth of a desperately poor nation. With most of the major civilizations, we see them eventually get killed by what amounts to a single social group hijacking the entire culture. In China, that was the bureaucrats, in Rome, the slave owners, and in India, that was the priests. Of course, a society dominated by the priests would say that all problems are spiritual and that nothing matters except the spiritual world, since saying anything else would create an opening for another social group to gain power and authority. This is probably a very blunt way of putting this, but I think it's apt. Imagine you just have a friend who did a massive amount of psychedelics, has an incredibly spiritual experience, and then wants to totally change their life, quit their job, and become a hippie in Bali. It would be responsible for you to pull them over and tell them they shouldn't totally uproot their life and should make responsible decisions since the real world actually does exist, rather than just some abstract spiritual ideal. India is that friend, completely submerging themselves in the spiritual world at the expense of the real physical one. However, this also gives India a spiritual liberation seen nowhere else in the world. The Indian worldview is so incredibly meta, it doesn't operate according to Western rules of fitting into boxes. The immense conformity of the caste system creates the counter-reaction of a very open religious view. India has never really burned heretics, and you're welcome to believe whatever you want to in India. India is the most religiously dynamic place in the world, since whenever Hinduism needs to adapt, some new guru shows up preaching a new doctrine. Indian thought is very logic-driven, but that logic is focused on immaterial truths rather than more earthly things. Indian philosophy has tried to figure out the ultimate nature of the world through logical structures so complex they make the Germans look simple. Is it any surprise that so many of the world's greatest scientists and people in technology today are Indian? After settling into the form it did under the Brahmin-dominated system a little bit before the birth of Christ, India experienced a dark age for the next few centuries. In a lot of ways, this was like the European Dark Age, in which cities and written records went down a lot, but life for the common person improved. Meanwhile, India became more and more glued into the international trade system. However, roughly from 200 AD to 800 AD, India experienced its golden age. From roughly 200 AD to 800 AD, India experienced its great golden age. You had empires like Harshas, the Guptas, the Chalukyas, but in general, India buzzed with energy. Part of the reason for this is that the other main civilizations were struggling with barbarian invasions, but India was incredibly wealthy, culturally influential, and the like. At the same time, we saw the development of a greater India, and that most of Southeast Asia formed under the influence of Indian traders and priests, something I talk about in my video about Southeast Asia. However, even though India was doing well, they were in their universal empire, a period of wealth and stability built off the achievements of the original, more creative culture, while no new innovation was taking place. This took place with classical civilization under the Pax Romana, and is currently happening in the West under the Pax Americana. In India's case, the empire wasn't political, but was the rigid social code run by the priests. It was a universal culture. Decadence is a natural effect of the development of civilization, which I talk about in this video. India was gradually disconnecting itself from the real world. Visitors to India described them as the most arrogant people in the world, completely disinterested in anything outside India's borders. The Indians considered the people of modern Pakistan unclean since they were in close proximity to non-Hindus who were polluting them, thus showing a society completely incapable of external feedback. Then came the Muslims. I almost find the matchup between Indic and Muslim civilization comical. If you were to create an uneven battle, you'd pick a culture like India, which had no interest in military affairs, glorified pacifism, were split by caste, and a tropical irrigation culture run by priests that didn't believe in the importance of objective reality. And then you pair them with Islam, a religion made by warrior desert herders, which literally considers violently spreading the religion holy, with some of the most effective militaries in the world and meritocratic, while being spread by the warlike Turkic, Persian, and Arab peoples. The matchup went about exactly as well as you'd expect. Ever since the time of the Persian Empire in around 500 BC, Middle Eastern dynasties controlled the western bank of the Indus River, or roughly half of modern Pakistan. For the first couple hundred years, the Arabs controlled that region, peripherally involved in India. However, around 1000 AD, the Turks, led by the genius commander Mahmud of Ghazni, smashed into the North Indian plain. India was completely unable to deal with the Muslims. Mahmud won his top battle at Panipat against a local Indian force outnumbered 10-1. As the Muslims conquered more and more of India, the local Indian Rajas responded by building temples to get the gods to honor them more with victory, rather than actually winning battles or improving their militaries. This has been a consistent problem with India over its history, in that militarily, it has not been able to compete with other societies, resulting in, for the most part, over the last 2,000 years, much of the North Indian plain being ruled by foreign dynasties, mostly from Central Asia and Afghanistan, pouring over the Khyber Pass into India. Of the 22 invasions of India, 19 have succeeded. India has consistently been beaten militarily in almost every case, which in many ways has been the death knell for its civilization. It's kind of hard to say why this happened. There are a couple confounding variables that make it difficult to find a clear one. One being that irrigation societies, and especially rice-based ones, tend to fight fairly poorly since rice farming is so physically difficult, and also it's all year round, unlike wheat where men can farm for half the year and fight for the other half. Likewise, in irrigation societies like this, 90% of the population suffers diseases like ringworm and malaria that cause lifelong lethargy. Likewise, you really struggle to find many militarily successful societies in the tropics and subtropics. Seeming exceptions like the Aztecs or Inca come from temperate highlands, and India's best warriors are either the Gurkhas from the high Himalayas or the Rajputs, descendants of barbarians themselves from India's more temperate northwest. Finally, the caste system would prevent military talent from rising up, and the priest-dominated society that emphasized the uselessness of the political world and gloried in pacifism would also promulgate non-military norms. There were a series of earlier invaders like the Huna or Huns, the Kushans, and other similar Central Asians, which conquered much of northern India starting before the birth of Christ. However, those were all tribal peoples that quickly assimilated into Indian civilization, thus allowing a new wave of invaders to repeat the same thing. However, with the Muslims, we saw something totally different, with in that they had a competitive, virile civilization that posed a real threat to India. The first wave of Muslim conquest seized the area of modern Pakistan, and then the next one in the 1100s seized control of the whole of North India. In the third case, in the 1300s, a new wave of energetic Muslims conquered most of the Indian subcontinent, raiding down nearly to the bottom of the subcontinent. What happened was that every few centuries, a new wave of Muslim tribes would come out of the Afghan mountains, building upon previous Muslim gains who had since grown decadent in India. These peoples were often Central Asian Turks with armies of Afghans and Persians working with them. The Muslims were brutal in India. They viewed the Indians as idolatrous and looted and burned their temples. They brutally repressed India's peasants, taxing them to the bone. They likely killed millions. However, as the ash cleared, life continued as usual. Islam offered a dynamic vision of the world, not held back by caste or the Brahmins. Thus, large parts of India converted to Islam, whether modern Pakistan in proximity to the Middle East or Bangladesh, which was still developing in the Middle Ages and thus lightly populated, and thus not as entrenched into the dominant Brahminical culture. The Hindus responded in exactly the way you'd expect them to. Their attitude was that if they couldn't win the wars with the Muslims and their bodies were conquered, their spirits would remain free. You saw a reaction of greater Hindu conservatism due to the Muslim conquests, resulting in the intensification of caste taboos and religiosity. This all culminated in the Mughal Empire, in which India was ruled by a dynasty of Central Asian Muslim Turks, ruling almost all the subcontinent around the year 1700. However, from that point, India went into a direction almost no one could have expected. The first Europeans to arrive off India were the Portuguese around 1500, who traveled all the way around Africa to find India's massive wealth in spices. They and the later Dutch established ports around India's coast and then became what amounts to pirates. Due to their more advanced naval technology and military ability, the Europeans were extremely quickly able to totally dominate the naval traffic and oceans around India. However, on the land, the Europeans were no match for the truly massive Mughal Empire. However, in the early 18th century, the Mughal Empire collapsed, replaced by a series of warring states in which India fell into anarchy. Afghans poured into India once again, pushing all the way to Bangladesh, while the Persians looted Delhi. However, this chaos resulted in pulling in the two most dynamic European nations of the time, Britain and France, into a scramble for India. Both the British and the French had forts on the coast of India for trading and never consciously wanted to make an Indian empire. However, as the surrounding Indian regions collapsed into anarchy, they started to send their troops outwards to solidify territory, and since India has no clearly defensible boundaries, they just kept on going until the British were pulled into conquering the whole thing. The quality of the European troops, which were local Indians trained to fight like Europeans, called sepoys, was so much higher than the local fighting methods that the Europeans could win battles incredibly outnumbered. The British beat the French during the 7 Years' War in the middle of the 18th century, and then over the next century conquered the entirety of India from the Hindu Kush to the borders of Thailand, thus truly unifying India for the first time. The British colonization of India is really a complicated thing to talk about since the British did both amazing things and evil things. On one side, the British were deeply racist and condescending to the local Indians, while British negligence allowed some of the largest famines ever in history to happen in India, killing tens of millions. The Indians do have many reasons to hate the British. However, the British also established India's democracy, its modern borders, introduced science and modern education, India's bureaucracy, its railroad system, and the like. Modern India, whether or not they like to admit it, is a creation of the British. The British were largely the best of the colonial powers of any European country, and we see this in how former British colonies tend to be much better off than those of other colonial powers. I mean, just compare India to Indonesia, where the Dutch basically built no social institutions in their century of colonization there. For a balanced view of the colonial period, I would read both Shashi Tharoor's Inglorious Empire and Niall Ferguson's Empire to show two fundamentally different but true perspectives on British India as a way to create some kind of middle ground. For Indians, this fundamental insecurity to their colonial masters, the British, who mistreated them but also gave them so much, is a massive psychological pain. The British offered a new view of the world that was in many ways very different and difficult for Indians to deal with. For Indian civilization, which is fundamentally religious, the British offered a secular scientific worldview that was incredibly strange. It took Indian intellectuals more than a century to be able to comprehend modern science into their worldview. Now, India is in many ways a society split between a more westernized secular elite and a Hindu majority, which is the legacy of the British. India gained independence after World War II since Britain was so tired from fighting the world wars it simply did not have the money or vigor to keep the empire. At the same time, India's independence movement, as led by Gandhi, did an admirable job of creating a peaceful resistance movement based around India's greatest strength, its religion. And Gandhi, in a lot of ways, is very emblematic of Indian civilization, using pacifism and indirect methods to gain political independence. India was split into four, with this split being a highly polarizing issue in modern India. I'm not going to talk too deeply here about the current politics of the subcontinent, but Pakistan, which seems more a part of Muslim civilization at this point than Indian, has been underwhelming. It's been an underdeveloped, unstable military dictatorship that's barely modernized and is still close to feudal. Bangladesh, meanwhile, has put most of its resources into increasing its population while using its cheap labor to make t-shirts. India itself is a very complicated story today. The Indians have successfully remained one of Asia's most dynamic democracies and economically have surged forward, especially in their tech and service industries. However, India's economic growth is uneven, with many social issues with side effects that hold India back. India still has deep systemic issues, but the Indians also have a tremendous amount going for them. Whether a young population, some very, very smart people, some very dynamic economies, and the energy that comes from really being a one-of-a-kind place in the world. It's impossible to predict what will happen in India in the near future, but I'm damn certain it's going to be interesting. What a Feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, or stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pillar, Pearl, or Patreon. As always, thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.